call the 14th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance to order, continuing our study of Bill C-9, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 4th, 2010, and other measures. Colleagues, as you know, we are going through Bill C-9 part by part, and we were still on Part 6 at our last meeting. I will, colleagues, just in the interest of time, perhaps if we could try to be as brief as possible in our questions. I'm going to recommend we do rounds of 5 minutes maximum. If people still have questions beyond that, I'll perhaps put them at the bottom of the list in terms of asking questions. But we will try to get through this section in as many parts as we can. Today we have 2 hours until 5:30, and we have Mr. McGurr with us back again. Thank you for coming back, Mr. McGurr.
Thank you.
And are there any further questions then on Part 6? No further? Okay. Thank you, Mr. McGurr.
Could I just want as much as I would love to stand up, there was one question that was left over from the last session where I was asked explicitly the number of companies that were involved, number of crown corporations that were involved in hydro generation.
Sorry, is there a problem?
They go to Part 7 and he's...
I called for questions on Part 6. I didn't hear anyone ask.
Well, it's because we didn't hear you call for questions on Part 6.
Okay.
None of us could hear you. Okay.
Okay. First of all, let's have Mr. McGurr. You wanted to clarify something on Part 6?
I just wanted to respond to a question that I wasn't able to respond to at the last session, where someone, I forget who it was, asked me the number of crown corporations that were involved in the generation of hydroelectricity. There are 8. It's Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, New Brunswick Power, Hydro-Quebec, Ontario Power Generation, Manitoba Hydro, Sask Power, BC Hydro, and Columbia Power. Okay,
thank you for that information. We do have 2 colleagues with questions. Monsieur Mulcair, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for reappearing, Mr. McGurr, and thank you for the list that you've just given us of a Crown Corporation involved in the generation of hydroelectricity throughout Canada. I would like to come back to the discussion we had earlier this week, and to come back to your statement to the effect that if we wanted to constitute corporate entities or distinct corporations, without any, all joking aside, I'm wondering if you could explain your thoughts a bit more, because Hydro-Quebec, there is such a silo between...
Point of order, Mr. Menzies.
We are not talking about Hydro-Quebec. We're not talking about Ontario Hydro. We're here talking about C9, and if that honourable member can point out to me somewhere in this piece of legislation those 2 items, I will tolerate this. But he had an entire meeting to talk about what wasn't even in C9. I would request, Mr. Chair, that we move on.
Okay. On the same point of order, Mr. Mulcair.
I recognize the tactics used by my colleague and friend, Mr. Menzies, but I would say that he's coming a bit late in the game, because he's trying to put stop the gaps in his own ship. The chair has allowed us having this major discussion on equalization, which is the subject of Part 6, which we are dealing with now. We had a beginning of a discussion. We agreed that that discussion had to be continued, and the elected members of Quebec have the right to ask questions in this committee, and I would never allow anyone from the government to dictate what questions I can ask.
Questions relate to Bill C-9. If you can explain that to the chair.
Parfaitement, comme vous l'avez permis avant-hier, Monsieur.
As you allowed on Tuesday, you know that Bill C-9 deals with a number of issues, including issues related to equalization. And these parts deal, as we know, with social transfer, the equalization program, and we had a question for officials dealing with equalization with regard to a different treatment between what the federal gives to Quebec, because in Quebec we believe that you cannot. There are silos at Hydro-Quebec, and they themselves find it too difficult to find the profits of the single corporate entity. Please do not interrupt me while I'm trying to answer the chair. Well, that's enough. That's enough. A little politeness, please. So what I was trying to say, Mr. Chair, was the following. Mr. McGeer gave us some very thoughtful answers earlier this week, and I'd like to try to have him explain why, in their view, it's too complicated to look within those crown corporations, which also generate higher electricity. He said that the generation was compared to other forms of generation and could were taken into account in equalization formulas. We've seen that with the corporate entities at Hydro-Quebec, it should be a distinct case, because if we treat corporate entities differently, but the question that remained was why they don't consider the numbers given by Hydro-Quebec as being valid. And he's saying because they come from Quebec, and I find that a bit short as an answer, and I'd like to come back to that today. And for the reasons why we talked about this earlier this week, I will not tolerate that what was relevant 2 days ago is no longer relevant today.
And I did give a lot of leeway last time with respect to questions on this section, but I frankly, as the chair, I understand there is some concern about that issue, and I understand what your concern is, Mr. Mulcair, but I don't understand how that concern relates to Bill C-9. We have clauses 1646, 1647, 1648. My understanding was this was with respect to clause 1647, but with respect to the different treatment of Crown corporations, I don't see how that relates to clause 1647. So what I'm seeking, maybe Mr. Carrier can clarify, is how that relates, that concern, which may be a very valid concern, I'm not saying it's not, relates to clause 1647 or another clause within Bill C-9.
Est-ce que j'ai la parole?
Oui.
The floor. Well, Mr. Chair, I would ask you to survey the impressions of committee members before taking a position. I would like to point out that Part 1 of Part 6, well, the title is Additional Fiscal Equalization Payment. So we're talking about Section 312, an additional fiscal equalization payment. So there are some elements indicated there. And I think this would be the ideal time to raise the issue as to why there aren't amounts provided for Quebec with regard to the different treatment that we've seen for at least the past year between the federal government and Quebec government. And this is the time to get some structured answers, as I indicated the other day, to get answers that are unbiased, unpolitical, to receive logical and calm-headed explanations on the situation, to explain why Quebec isn't included and gets a different treatment because of Hydro-Quebec.
Additional funds under the additional fiscal equalization payment. Is that your argument?
Oui.
Linked to an explanation of how Quebec would be entitled to additional monies under Clause 1646 or related to the other two clauses. But we should keep our questions related to the clauses of the actual piece of legislation. And we should as well, if there is a policy discussion, a policy that's been determined by the government but not by public service, those questions are obviously for ministers. They are not necessarily questions we can ask of department officials. So Mr. Mulcair, as long as you can link your questions then to a clause of the bill and additional funding for Quebec.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, revenons à la partie 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's come back to Part 6, the fiscal equalization payments to provinces, if you will, Mr. McGurr. When we had the pleasure of discussing earlier this week, you stated something concerning the equalization calculation, which I will remind you, in 1647, where you have the subsection 24702B of the Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. And so we are trying to understand how and why Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Manitoba, Prince Edward Islands are entitled to a substantial increase, and why we're talking about Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador, and that a demand that's on the table, which is a policy one with regard to determining the value of what is generated by Hydro-Quebec and the influence that might have on the same equalization calculation that's quoted in Part 6. So if I come back to what you said earlier this week, you explained two different things. You said, first of all, that it is difficult to know exactly the revenues generated by production or generation, and you look at the overall profits. You raised the possibility of Hydro-Quebec setting up different or distinct corporate entities. I demonstrated that Hydro-Quebec did indeed constitute distinct corporate entities that operated in a silo. They don't even share their figures amongst one another and generate separate reports at the end of the year. And you rejected that offhand, saying that those were figures given by Quebec. I would like to know, in light of your analysis with regard to those distinct corporate entities, that you refuse to accept the figures put forward by Hydro-Quebec.
What the payments are that are being set out in Part 6 of the Act. Those payments are simply payments that make sure that the total major transfers to provinces are at least as high as they were in 2009-10 and 2010-11. In other words, we've compared the amount of equalization, Canada Health Transfer, and Canada Social Transfer that were calculated for each province, compared the amounts in 2010-11 with the amounts in 2009-10. If there was to be any decline in that total global amount, a province was provided with a protection payment, as set out in Part 6 of the Act. The other parts of your question is dealing with the actual calculation of equalization for Quebec. And again, as I responded at the previous session, the policy is simply that we take the remitted profits in their entirety of a Crown corporation that's engaged in the generation of hydroelectricity. And as I said at the beginning of this session, there are 8 of them. And I'd just like to point out that of those 8, 6 are engaged in some form in transmission and distribution, just as much as Hydro-Quebec. And so, even in the case, let me choose, Sask Power is engaged in both transmission and distribution. Any of the remitted profits of Sask Power, no matter what the source is, would be considered part of the natural resource base, just as it is for the province of Quebec in the case of Hydro-Quebec.
You got 30 seconds, Mr. Mulcair, and then we'll go to Mr. Carrier.
I'm going to wait. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Carrier, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci.
Carrier, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to get in at least one question on the issue before moving to another part. Last Tuesday, Mr. McGeer, you told us that if you consider all the other Crown corporations that produce or distribute hydroelectricity, that the $250 million amount which Quebec has been referring to would not be adequate. So the $250 million is not an estimate that our party has come up with. It's in the document, the budget document produced by the government of Quebec. In Schedule E, it is indicated that there is an unfairness, and that unfairness is to the tune of $250 million, which they are expecting from the government of Canada, with whom it is in negotiations. So that amount is not a fictitious one. It is probably based on the same treatment in Ontario in terms of determining corporate profits and not profits coming from corporate natural resources. So I don't understand why there are a number of generation corporations that amount could be reduced. This is the same policy. If you apply it to one, it should be applied in the same manner to each distribution company in order for it to be fair. And that's why the government of Quebec is expecting a $250 million amount. Are you looking to reduce the amounts given to other provinces? But that would be unfair. So the same policy should apply to all provinces, for Quebec and for the others, and for other distribution crown corporations. Would you agree with my view?
$50 million. I said the $250 million was, in fact, the estimate that was put forward by the province of Quebec. Right. I'm familiar with the $250 million that was put forward into the budget document. That $250 million has been calculated only on the basis of removing the transmission and distribution profits that have been reported by Hydro-Quebec and redoing the equalization calculation. Quebec calculates that would give the province another $250 million. But as you've just indicated, the policy should be extended to all Crown corporations. If you, in fact, are going to be removing transmission and distribution profits, it should be done for all Crown corporations. And on Tuesday, I didn't give a figure. I just said the $250 million figure may not be $250 million. I certainly didn't say which direction it would be. I just said $250 million may not be $250 million. But interestingly enough, I should point out there is a Crown corporation also that's involved just in transmission and distribution called BC Transmission. And just like Ontario 1, it is counted as part of the business income tax base and not part of the natural resource base.
OK. Oh, ça va.
Okay. Monsieur Menard, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Menard? No.
Please, thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witness once again. Please correct me if I'm wrong in these numbers that I'm quoting, but it's my understanding that equalization to Quebec has been increased by some 44% from 06 to 2010. This year alone, $19.3 billion in federal support to Quebec. Equalization alone, $8.5 billion to the province of Quebec, which is nearly 80% higher than it was in 2005, slightly above the growth of inflation, I would think. And that health transfers for all provinces continue to increase at around the 6%. Social transfers increase at around 3% for all provinces to try and be fair. Please correct me if I'm wrong in those figures, but my question is, these transfers that are in the budget, my guess is that each province that has already tabled a budget has actually put these numbers into their budgeting process and are counting on that. Am I correct in that assumption?
I can't confirm that with any certainty, but I would imagine they have, because they were provided with these amounts back at the finance minister's meeting in Whitehorse. So any provincial budget that has happened since that time would have taken these payments into account.
Which was in December.
Yes.
So, and my figures quoted previously are pretty accurate.
They're accurate.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Menzies. Monsieur Mulcair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to come back to what exactly the BC1 in BC1?
E-transmission.
Donc, je veux juste m'assurer d'avoir bien saisi.
I want to make sure I understood correctly. So Hydro-Quebec has 3 corporate entities that are completely distinct and operate in silos. One is a generation, transmission, and distribution. The argument put forward by Hydro-Quebec is that the generation entity should be considered under the natural resources, and the other two as a business profits.
Transmission and distribution profits, Hydro-Quebec should be moved to the business income tax base just as the same way as the profits from Hydro One are treated in Ontario's Hydro One.
On s'entend.
I've just said that the policy is that we take the remitted profits of the full corporation, and Hydro-Quebec is one corporation.
D'accord.
I do know that they report their figures separately. I am aware of that. Other Crown corporations that are engaged in both hydroelectric generation and in transmission and distribution do not have the same degree of detail as Hydro-Quebec.
Juste m'assurer encore une fois d'avoir bien compris.
I make sure I understood correctly, Mr. Chair. You're affirming today that a Crown corporation like BC1, I had understood EC1, I'm sorry, Hydro One, they are solely engaged in the distribution and transmission. That's a distinct corporation, and all that it falls under the business tax part.
Income tax base.
Voilà. Ça va de ce côté-là. Vous êtes en train de nous dire.
So you're saying that, in your view, Hydro-Quebec is a single corporation, and therefore the Hydro-Quebec's profits cannot benefit from that different treatment given to those corporations in other provinces, because Hydro-Quebec, in your view, would be a single corporation. Now, is that correct?
Amount of remitted profits of a Crown corporation engaged in hydroelectricity generation is taken into account in the natural resource base, and Hydro-Quebec is a corporation engaged in hydroelectricity generation.
Donc, je reviens à notre conversation plus tôt.
So I'll come back to our conversation we had earlier this week, when you stated, hypothetically speaking, that if Hydro-Quebec were to establish distinct Crown corporations to engage in those three business lines, so the generation would remain where it is, and the other two, distribution, transmission, they could receive different tax treatment under equalization. So they would receive the same treatment as BC1 and Hydro One. Am I correct?
Quebec was split into separate companies. The policy says that the remitted profits in their entirety of a Crown corporation, if it's engaged in hydroelectricity generation, is part of the natural resource base. So clearly, if Hydro-Quebec split itself in such a way that a new separate company was engaged just in transmission and distribution, clearly we'd have to revisit the equalization treatment.
Ben, c'est merveilleux parce qu'il s'agit effectivement.
Well, that's wonderful, because they are distinct corporations, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to discuss that further. Thank you. Thank you.
We'll move to Part 7 then. Thank you very much, Mr. McGurr. We appreciate that. Now, Part 7 amends the Expenditure Restraint Act to impose a freeze on the allowances and salaries to be paid to members of the Senate and the House of Commons for 2010, 2011, 11-12, and 12-13. Any question? I hope that's not on the record. Mr. McKay, please.
You all could tell us how much this is actually going to count for. How much in dollars?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As members will know much better than I, there are about 413 members of the House and Senate, and the average salary is about $160,000 a year for those two groups, roughly. So each member will be having a freeze, a loss of 1.5% this year. That would be about a loss of $2,200 times 413. It's about $1 million this year.
$1 million. That's it. Have you? Well, certainly I would support that for Conservative members of Parliament and senators. And does the freeze apply to judges? Does the freeze apply to judges, federally appointed judges?
No, judges are captured by the Budget 2009 provisions, which apply separately. So these changes simply reflect provisions for members of the House and the Senate and the Prime Minister and ministers.
So has there been any calculation? At one point, our salaries were tied to judges, and now no longer. Has there been any calculation if this freeze was applied to those judges as to what that would constitute in terms of getting back to balance? Is it so quaintly phrased?
Perhaps, Mr. Chair, I could answer it in a slightly different way. In 2005, Parliament adopted a change to parliamentary compensation whereby instead of having MPs and senators' salaries linked to judges' salaries, they were tied to a formula of private sector wage increases. So members of the House and Senate would receive an increase every April 1st based on the previous year's wage increase for the private sector. The legislative approach for judges is stipulated in the Judges Act and has a separate process.
You don't know. You didn't do any calculation with respect to how much that would be if they were tied to the same process as we are.
No, I haven't done that for the judges. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, thank you very much for being with us here today. We will move to Part 8, amendments relating to certain governmental bodies. Are there any questions on this part? Mr. McKay again.
This apparently eliminates 245 positions. Were these positions filled and were salaries being drawn?
The 245, they're part-time positions. So there's not salaries as such as per diems or non-honorariums on board members.
But are these positions filled right now?
90% are vacant, approximately 90%, yeah.
So it's an illusion of saving money rather than a reality of saving money.
It's a cost avoidance. If they were to be filled, they would cost money.
The Canada Pension Plan, you're changing it from 400 GIC appointments to 360 GIC appointments. Men subjects in the cap, members appointed GIC to the... So, presumably this is where Canadians go before a tribunal and say, well, I'm not being fairly treated, I'm not qualified, or I'm being disqualified from receiving my pension, things of that nature. My experience as a practicing member of Parliament is that this is a pretty messed up system, that it takes a long time to get there, that that people are frustrated, don't know what's going on, and so you already are down on the complement by, well, I'm assuming that the 40 positions you're apparently eliminated are already not filled, so you're really not eliminating anything. And so are you actually then loading on to the 360 who still have their appointments, the difficulties that many of us actually experience as members of Parliament?
We're not actually eliminating positions or people as such. We're reducing the cap. The cap had been fixed at 400. Currently, there's approximately about 300 people in positions. The analysis that was done, just so you know...
300 people, not 360?
No, at the moment, there's about 300 people.
300 people
positions.
In 360 positions?
No. There were 400. The cap is 400.
Yes.
Currently, that's a maximum. Currently, there are 300 positions that are filled. We are reducing the cap to bring it down to 360, to leave a marge de manœuvre to make sure that if requirements are needed, we'll have additional positions filled. The review that was done, the analysis that had been done, is that there is no backlog on requests. and that the complement of 360 would be sufficient to meet the demands.
So at the present time, 300 people fill what was available 400 positions. So you're actually moving that down to 360 and leaving 60 vacant.
We're leaving it open in case there's a need to have additional members to treat the demand. Yes.
I would be somewhat curious to see that study which says that these things are being dealt with in a timely sort of way. That is not consistent with my experience. I can't speak for other members at the table. Okay, I'll let it go for the time being.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wallace, please.
And thank you for coming. Just for my clarification then, these positions exist on the books, and thus, from a budgetary point of view, the government has to budget for these positions whether people are in them or not. Would that be correct?
The organizations have to kind of keep it in mind, yes, that they have to, there's a possibility, as long as they exist on the books, there is a possibility that the Governor and Council might fill the position.
So if the government of the day decided that they want to fill all 400 positions overnight,
you're talking about the 400?
Well, I'm using this one as an example.
Okay.
The organization has to have the money to be able to pay these people for the meetings that they would attend. Would that not correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Monsieur Carrier, s'il vous plaît.
Oui.
Mr. Carrier, welcome. You indicated earlier that among the positions that were cut, 90% were vacant. So how do you cost the savings of this policy? What is your assessment of the savings made from these cuts? Well, we haven't evaluated that. This wasn't simply a bean counting exercise. This was to make sure that the boards had the proper management and governance in place. If the 245 positions were filled, we estimate that the cost, and this is a very approximate estimate that was done with Treasury Board, if we paid daily allowances, travel fees, and what have you, that the approximate cost would be between 1 and 1.25 million for the 245 positions. That's under the assumption that the positions would be filled. Is that a realistic assumption? Are the positions, although they're 90% vacant, were there strong possibilities that they could be filled, or were there simply useless positions that you want to eliminate? Well, I can't pronounce myself on that. I think the positions that are filled have been by the Governor and Council and under recommendation by the appropriate minister. I cannot speak on each position as to whether they had intended to fill each position, but the assessment showed that those positions were no longer necessary. I've read somewhere that you looked at a number of positions before making those cuts. How many positions did you assess? Well, we reviewed approximately 2,700 positions in about 200 organizations. Those 2,700 positions, do they represent everyone appointed by the Governor and Council? No. Some positions weren't assessed. Actually, we assessed positions on councils, organizations, international organizations. We did not examine judges' positions or parliamentary officers. We didn't look at the lieutenant governors or deputy minister positions. We simply looked at the public agencies, administrative tribunals, and we came up with that 2,700 figure. We're in a period of budgetary restraint. Was your mandate also to consider executive positions within the entire public service? No, that wasn't part of our mandate to look at the public service. No. We simply looked at the Governor and Council appointments. As for public servants, those aren't GIC appointments apart from deputy minister and associate deputy ministers. Because what we're discussing at present is a very minimal measure. It's with very minimal impact. It's simply a downsizing of potential positions, and there aren't really any savings made. The actual savings made will be in the area of $1 million or so. Well, that's exactly what I said earlier. But over and above the savings, there are agencies or organizations that will become more effective by having a bit more limited boards. Thank you.
Much. Merci beaucoup. We'll now go to Part 9, amendments to the Pensions Benefits Standards Act. We'll ask the officials to come forward. Okay. Welcome. We'll start with Mr. McKay, please.
Thank you, witnesses. The first paragraph in the briefing book I don't really have much dispute with. It's the second paragraph with respect to the solvency deficit at termination must be fully funded and permit employers to use letters of credit. Now we're kind of in the middle of our discussions about and study of pensions. And letters of credit have been a matter of some subject of discussion here. It appears that the government wishes to prejudge the findings of the committee. I have some skepticism with respect to letters of credit because if a plan is close to bankruptcy or insolvency, it would seem to me counterintuitive to think that it or its employers, the funding element of the plan, could actually go out and get a letter of credit which would effectively satisfy, in the way this is set up, 15% of the outstanding obligations. I'm assuming that you may well have had some extensive discussions with various plans and plan holders and things of that nature. What evidence do you have that letters of credit would actually be available to plans that are on the edge?
I think in the first instance, the availability question, the principle of it is to increase cash flow for sponsors. And in terms of providing security to the plan itself, they will be fully backed. They're fully guaranteed. So in terms of keeping the plan whole, it's just as good as cash because it's a fully secured line of credit.
But if I'm a bank and I'm being asked to supply a letter of credit, which, as you rightly say, is just as good as cash, how is it that I'm going to be able to get a letter of credit when my plan is on the edge of insolvency?
The letters of credit have been used already in two temporary regulations that were adopted by the government in 2006 and 2009, and these were for temporary relief, and they were used by a certain number of corporations. You could say that it's based on the credit worthiness of the corporation.
So were they used at the point where plans were on the edge of insolvency, or had been, or were missing, were not adequately funding their ratios?
The purpose of the letters of credit in those regulations was to provide security to the plan instead of cash contributions that would otherwise have been required. It's not necessary that the companies that avail themselves of this measure were on the verge of bankruptcy. It's really for corporations that would rather keep their cash resources for other purposes in the company, to invest in the company, and use the letter of credit as a security for the pension plan, so that the pension plan is in effect in a neutral position, whether it's cash or it's the letter of credit that is serving as security.
So presumably there's almost an inducement therefore to use letters of credit rather than cash. If I'm a employer, a corporation, I'm always going to want to use credit over cash to fund any obligations I might have.
I guess there is a limit of 15%. So there is a limit on it.
I understand that, but if it's 15% of a, if it's $1 million credit or $1 million cash, I know the choice I would make as an employer.
You were mentioning, can you get it on the brink when you're on the brink of insolvency? And I think the issue is this is one tool that can help with funding flexibility to avoid that situation. So a company in a cash crunch has another alternative. If they're short on cash, the letter of credit can help them avoid going into a deeper trench.
Well, if I am on the brink of insolvency or whatever, how is the government going to monitor the getting of a letter of credit to solve these solvency ratios? And because it seems to me that if I instead of putting in cash, I'm putting in a letter of credit, it seems to me that's a tip-off that I would that my solvency or that my plan is in problem. How are you going to know who's going to decide?
I think it wouldn't necessarily be the case that the companies making use of the letters of credit would be in that position. It would be, I think, in a case of how they would want to use their cash resources at a particular point in time. That would be also whatever credit they use for the pension plan is not available for other purposes that the company might consider. So I'm not sure that it would necessarily always be the choice of the company to use letter of credit as much as available. It would depend on the company's investment plans, things that are outside of the pension plan.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Mr. Menzies now, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank our witnesses for appearing here today. And I might explain to John and some of the other members that remind them, I'm sure that I've reminded you a couple of times, that this is about the 7% of pension plans, private pension plans, that we actually regulate federally, and some of them were in serious trouble over the last year, and that's why we put these changes in. They're not out of the woods yet, and I guess that would be my question. I've tried to implore this committee to move this along quickly because we have a June 30th deadline on the solvency of many of these funds that are not out of the woods, where we seem to be stalling this bill because some people say there's too many fringe things in here. We've got some very important legislation. Is this not probably one of the most time-sensitive issues in this bill?
I would think certainly this does put in place a relief or enhanced benefit security for pension members, very important. Certain rules need to be in place in advance of the solvency evaluations, which my colleague can speak to. And certainly the bill needs to be passed in order some of the regulations to bring in effect the broad sweeping changes that the government announced last October are dependent on provisions in this bill being enforced. So until the bill is enforced, some other regulations cannot be brought into force. But on the evaluation question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, actuarial evaluations for federally regulated pension plans are required to be filed within 6 months of the year end that the valuation is done for. So for most plans, that's December 31, so their due date is June 30th. So at this point, many plan sponsors are waiting with anticipation the passage of these measures so that they can anticipate how much funding they will need to make in their pension plans for this year and in future.
And we're talking billions and billions of dollars here. Pretty serious change for some of these funds. So, thank you. That's all. I just wanted to get that point on the record.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Carrier.
Merci. Bonjour.
Good afternoon. I was wondering, Part 9 that we're considering now does not talk about companies that go bankrupt, and which is of some consideration in a number of our writings. I'm wondering whether a solution had not been considered by your department with regard to the placement of certain pension plans under a trusteeship. I'm wondering if you could talk to us about that, whether that was something that was studied within your department and what could be the consequences of such a policy.
Certainly, that's a major issue. Heard a lot about everybody throughout the media and letters that we've received in the department and across the government. I would say, with respect to pension plans, there are safeguards in place in the event of insolvency. In the first instance, the money that people pay into pension plans, it is held in trust and there for pensioners when they retire. Unfunded but due pension deficiencies or pension payments, the government made changes to give them a super priority in the event of insolvency. More broadly speaking, though, any liabilities, in terms of keeping the plan whole in the event of insolvency, that is an issue that has received much discussion, and that the bankruptcy and insolvency legislation is a matter for the Minister of Industry, and I know that that ministry is looking into that issue, as committed to in the throne speech, that they would examine issues with respect to pension plans in the event of insolvency.
Okay. Merci.
Mr. McKay, please.
Well, just to speak to Mr. Menzies' point, this has been a matter that's been hanging around for quite a while, and there's no reason this couldn't have been introduced as a separate piece of legislation. It could have been introduced months ago if, in fact, there was a timeline that it was of concern. I don't know whether I'm in favor of it or I'm against it, because I haven't heard from witnesses, but the witnesses are going to be jammed into a short period of time, and then it's kind of an all-or-nothing deal. So, I reject the premise of Mr. Menzies' point. With respect to the issue of the workout scheme, you say, will the workout scheme result in the employer being able to force members into an agreement that's not in their best interest? And the answer is no. And then further on, you say the workout scheme will permit sponsors, plan members, and retirees of a distressed pension plan to negotiate a funding arrangement. That strikes me as the guns at your head. We haven't got enough money, so too bad for you, retirees. Go visit your friends in Nortel. That's what it strikes me as. And I haven't absorbed the material entirely, to be fair, but it strikes me that the sponsor, the retirees, will be in some sort of negotiation. It'll be stalemated. They'll come to the minister, and the minister will make a decision and boom, the retirees have got no recourse.
I think that the key element there is that it requires all-party consent at the end of the process. So it's an alternative for everybody involved in the issues facing that company to be able to take some stock and see if funding rules can be changed in order to restructure the pension plan. And everybody will have a say in it. Everybody that has a stake in it will have a say in it. And I can't prejudge what that outcome will be, but presumably people will vote in their interest in the...
But are you actually enhancing the control of the retirees? Because some of these plans are in trouble because of stupid investment decisions which were made by people who thought they could make lots of money and they're way brighter than the rest of us. If in fact you're giving, when a plan's in trouble, you're giving some greater authority for a workout, but are you actually allocating greater authority to the retirees to control the investment decisions that get these plans in trouble in the first place?
Well, I think there's a few provisions there. A key one is there's greater disclosure that will be provided to plan members so that they can look at the situation of their plans on an ongoing basis and be better informed about its status. So it's taking quite a leap in terms of the elements of disclosure that are required. So,
but in some respects, disclosure doesn't cut it. I mean, if in fact I'm running a plan and you are a retiree, a potential retiree in the plan, and I disclose that I just bought a whole whack of derivative stuff through Goldman Sachs.
There are investment rules associated with the plan.
Well, I mean, there may be, but you know, you disclosed it. Thank you very much.
Mr. McKay,
it's still a big problem.
You've asked a good question. Ms. Anderson had one point, but I believe you had something further to add to the disclosure.
Sorry, I did it.
No, I think there's a wide range of disclosure elements that will enhance transparency about the status of the plan to members. But on the investment side, I mean, there are investment rules associated with the framework, and they are consistent with the prudent person rule, which the scenario you just described would not be consistent with that.
But as far as your amendments are concerned, there is nothing on that side of the equation, i.e. on the prudent person rule. Is that a fair assumption?
That's right. Well, I think, a lot of the issues that were faced by pension plans are a result of the situation on the stock market, which nobody predicted. And a lot of the trouble or difficulties or challenges that they were facing were a result of spikes. So another key element of the reforms being proposed is to smooth some of that for plan sponsors to be able to make it easier to make payments. Going over on an average 3-year versus a 1 year, the payments that they need to make, it's not based on, when it's reducing the pro-cyclicality.
Yeah, but is there anything in here which enhances the retirees, the beneficiaries' ability to participate in investment decisions?
And not that I'm aware of directly in the bill.
No, the plan administrator is responsible for making the investment decisions and must follow the prudent person rules and other fiduciary duties that are already part of the Act and regulations.
Yeah. I take your blandishments, but we've been talking a little bit too much to the Nortel folks. And, there's a lot of really strange investments decisions that were made which apparently complied with the prudent rule decision and resulted in real difficulties for these folks. So the plan, the proposals by the government seem to work on the one side of the equation, but don't necessarily work on the other side of the equation.
Well, they've answered that it's not in the legislation, which you may find insufficient.
No, but the point being, Chair, that maybe the government has come up with the perfect half solution.
Okay. Well, I suspect it's a matter of political debate. But. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Pichetti, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to witnesses. Just quickly, you're increasing the threshold for the surplus to 25%. Are you also changing the refundability? Will the company be able to take some of that money out? That was one of the points that's been addressed during the retirement pension retirement hearings.
I think you're referring to the income tax change to 25%. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's not part of the Pension Benefit Standards Act. That would be the Income Tax Act. It's a rule that how much surplus can stay in the plan before an employer can resume contributions to the plan. So because that threshold is being increased, there will be more situations where an employer is allowed to contribute to the plan, even though they are in a surplus position.
Correct, but will employers also have the opportunity to take out some of that surplus?
Okay. There are rules currently in the Act that govern how surplus refunds can be made under a pension plan. It can be done either after the plan terminates or while the plan is ongoing. It's subject to, they can go in two different ways. The one way is to show that they have a clear entitlement to the surplus under the terms of the plan and based on the historical versions of the plan. And the other way is to go through a process where they have a proposal of that 2/3 of members and 2/3 of retirees and other beneficiaries agree to the proposal. And they're also, as part of the legislation, before any surplus can be withdrawn from the plan, there is a mandatory cushion that needs to remain in the pension plan.
So the easing of those rules have not been eased? None of those rules have been eased?
Those rules are not being changed in this Act.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pichetti. Okay, thank you. I don't see any further questions on Part 9, so we will move to Part 10. The Agreement on Social Security between Canada and the Republic of Poland. Any questions on this part? Okay. You have a question, Mr. McKay?
The significance here, just explain to me why the retroactive to October 1st, 2009.
Essentially, there had been a procedural error in the coming into force of this agreement. The agreement by law needs to be tabled in both houses of Parliament. Due to a departmental procedural error, it was tabled only in the House and not in the Senate. This is an effort to ensure that both houses of Parliament have an opportunity to review the agreement and to ensure that people who would be entitled to benefits as of when the agreement was supposed to have come into force will be entitled to their full benefits.
So does that mean that both houses of Parliament are still going to have to review the agreement itself, and all you're doing is amending the date?
Essentially, by including this within the Budget Implementation Act, we are offering the houses an opportunity to review the agreement, and if it is passed within the budget, then the agreement will be deemed to have come into force retroactive to the original coming into force date.
I have no idea. Yeah,
Simple.
it's simple, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, first time I've ever
Strictly
seen it.
administrative.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. Anything further, Mr. McKay?
yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Carrier?
Oui, juste à titre d'information,
Just a point of clarification. Does that kind of bill or this agreement have to be contained in a Budget Implementation Act? Is it because there are budgetary implications that we find that agreement in this in C9, or are you taking advantage of C9 to include something like that in it?
By a procedural error that had occurred. Generally speaking, Social Security agreements would not be tabled along with the budget. They would be tabled within both houses of Parliament independently. As we are not in a position to meet our treaty obligations with Poland currently due to the error that has been made, we were seeking the fastest solution to ensure that people who are entitled to receive benefits will receive their full benefits as soon as possible. So this is an effort to ensure that that pensioners would be entitled to benefits from Canada and Poland as per the terms of agreement and in as quickly a time frame as possible.
OK. C'est-
Okay, merci. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us here today. We will move to Part 11, amendments to the Export Development Act, granting EDC the authority to open offices abroad, portfolio management in the Canada account. Any questions from members? Mr. McKay?
Just in terms of the management of portfolio risks, what does that mean that EDC will be able to do now that it hasn't been able to do thus far?
Thank you. EDC is actually looking for a clarification of the current wording in its act. So we're basically amending the act to enable the corporation to enter into any type of transaction which has as main objective to manage its portfolio risks that are necessary or desirable for the financial management of the corporation. EDC lawyers were of the view that the current wording in the Act was not clear enough, and they had requested such change. This was also a recommendation made in the context of the 2008 legislative review of the Export Development Act, and this recommendation was also accepted and supported by the government's response to that legislative review.
So why is it in a budget bill?
It was deemed, given the activity that EDC is currently under, and they are of the view that these transactions will enable them to deal with the various risks they are under right now. They were looking to have the clarity to be able to...
I understand that. It's just why is it in a budget bill? Okay. Well, I'm being unfair to you because it's a political decision to throw everything into a bill, which is 5. Yeah.
All right.
Oh, that was you.
That's different. Mr. McKay.
The substantive question here is: does this give you the power to purchase other insurance products to manage your portfolio?
When you say you are referring to the EDC. So
well,
yes,
maybe you as well. I don't know.
No, I work for the Department of Finance. But it would enable EDC to enter into transactions, be it swaps or hedges, in effort to diminish its risk. Sorry, does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, the problem is that swaps and hedges these days are getting a bad name, and so what are we doing here? We're legislating EDC to enter into transactions which are of higher category of risk.
No, I would say actually on the contrary, we're enabling the corporation to deal with its amount of risk. Although some financial instruments have got a bad reputation over the last few months, one would not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. These powers are also powers that are given to other crowns already. The BDC and the FCC already have similar powers, and EDC and the legislative review both thought that it was in the best interest, in the interest of the corporation, and hence the bottom line of the corporation and the bottom line of the Government of Canada, that they be allowed to enter in these transactions to deal with the risks they're involved in.
Does FCC and BDC use these powers?
It is my understanding that it is, yes, that they do. Excuse me.
Again, Chair, I don't know how to react to this stuff. This is like right out of left field, and it probably should be appropriately studied by another committee other than this one. Well, maybe it should be studied by this one, but you know, it's sort of like, well, here it is. Trust us. That's what it's becoming. End of question.
Okay, I'll take that as a statement.
Canada account. This includes forgiveness. The Canada account is essentially a fund that the staff recommends against, but the minister can do an override and make an investment for reasons best known to the minister. Now, will the ability of the minister, will the increased ability to buy hedges and swaps affect this Canada account?
Actually, the powers that are being given in Clause 1831 refer to EDC's corporate account. With regards to Clause 1833, as you do mention, this is related to the Canada account, which is Section 23 of the Export Development Act. Now, these transactions are one which, based on prudent risk management, EDC decides not to support, but then turns towards the government, and if they are deemed to be in national interest, EDC will enter in these transactions, but the risk will be borne on the government books and not on EDC's own books. So there is kind of
is a separate recognition in the books of EDC, both for the investments in the Canada account and the write-offs in the Canada account.
Excuse me?
So is it a separate recognition in the books of EDC that the Canada account's assets be recognized there, but also its write-offs be recognized there?
They are separate. Clause 1831 refers to what EDC management can, what type of transactions they can enter in to decrease the risk on their own account, whereas 1833 has to do with transactions that they can enter into to diminish the risk on our behalf, so on our books, on the government's account. An example of this, for instance, can be when airlines have difficulty paying back loans that were distributed for the purchase of aircraft. EDC can easily, on its corporate account, when the airline goes to a bankruptcy court, can restructure its loans. Now, here again, what is being sought is clarification of the current wording in the Act to enable EDC to basically do the same type of restructuring on our own, on Canada account exposure, that it can do on its corporate account exposure.
If the Canada account has lent money on an airline and the money is not paid back, or only part is paid back, what I don't understand is how is that treated differently than the way you do your corporate accounts?
For instance, if the bankruptcy court, or if there's a negotiation for the restructuring of a loan, if the negotiation with the airline has any write-off of any amount of interest or capital on the loan, EDC can, in a matter, or doesn't have to go get extra authority to accept what it deems to be the best deal possible for its bottom line. If it writes off one single penny of it, it can still accept that restructuring deal. Whereas they were lawyers in EDC who were working for us on Canada account, wanted more clarity to make sure that they could accept what they deemed to be the best bill, negotiation for the transaction that was made under Canada account. And they wanted to be...
So what does Mr. Clement do now?
Excuse me?
What does Mr. Clement do now when the lawyers are negotiating a resolution of a debt on the Canada account? How is it handled, and how is it handled different? How are you proposing it be handled differently?
My understanding is that the Export Development Canada is a Crown corporation that is arm's length from the government. So I don't see Minister Clement has to do with this.
Okay, well, maybe I'm missing something here. You're asking for an authority to enter into a transaction including the forgiveness in whole or part of any debt or obligation that's necessary for the management of assets and liabilities. Generally, that means we got a lousy piece of paper here, and we need to get rid of it, and we need to write it off. And what I'm finding puzzling is that, and you correct me if my understanding is incorrect, that the lawyers for the corporate account, the EDC account, they make their deal, end of story, fine. On the Canada account, they want to make their deal, but what happens? That they can't make their deal.
They thought, or they weren't sure, they wanted to make sure that they could accept the same deal on Canada account. They wanted to make sure that they could accept this deal even if it incurred a loss of either interest or principal on the loan.
So without this, what is it they do then?
Actually, the reason why this legislation is asked to be clarified is specifically related to an example as the one we're talking about. EDC officials were present in a bankruptcy proceeding case in the U.S. They accepted the deal under corporate account, and they were wondering if we could actually accept the same deal on Canada account, or if they were not able to do so. It took a lot of negotiating, weeks of deliberations between lawyers, between various departments, and it was deemed at that time that yes, we could do it, but that at any opportunity, one would want to clarify this and make sure that the Act does indeed permit this from being done.
So are there any specific historical examples where this was in question? I understand Mr. Wallace doesn't want to ask any questions directly, but are there any specific historical examples of this?
I would actually have to check. As you may imagine, with Export Development Canada, there are commercial sensitivities talking about bankruptcy. So I'd have to actually check with them if I can share those examples.
Well, the Canada account tends to be a bit politically sensitive, and you seem to be asking for, how should we say, more extensive authority for the resolution of problem loans.
So, Mr. McKay, your concern is about the amendment to Section 23?
Well, the Canada account, what they're asking for is Section 23, sub 6.
Yeah.
And what absent of context, you're left to deal with theoretical constructs. And what I don't understand here is what additional powers is the department asking for to deal with the Canada account?
Well, it states there's no additional new powers granted. Is that correct, Mr. Hall?
That is correct.
It says it gives them to make an investment or enter into any transaction, including the forgiveness in whole or in part of any debt or obligation that's necessary for the management of assets. If it wasn't necessary, why is it there?
As I previously mentioned, the clause is meant to clarify the current understanding of the powers that are already granted to Export Development Canada under the ED Act.
Yeah. I'm not going to. This format and this process is, in my view, not very good. But we'll leave it go.
Mr. Hall's not responsible for the formats.
No, I agree with them, and you know, my criticism to the government. This is a crazy way to do business.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll move to Part 12 then. Thank you, Mr. Hall. The Payment Card Networks Act. We have Monsieur Carrier and then Monsieur Moquer.
Oui.
Yeah.
Merci.
Thank you. Welcome again. If I understand correctly, Part 12, which deals with a new piece of legislation on payment card networks, which gives a lot of authority to the Governing Council. In Section 6, we see all the rules that the Governing Council could take with regard to payment card networks, payment card network operators, etc. And if I understand correctly, it refers to another act, which is the Canada Financial Consumer Agency Act of Canada. So the responsibility that's being transferred through that other legislation is to supervise payment card network operators so that they comply with the provisions of the Payment Card Networks Act, and to ensure that they comply with the provisions of that act. So it's perhaps it sets or clarifies the responsibilities under that new legislation, and confirm me if I'm correct, if that's the intent of this part of the bill. I'm wondering if you've assessed the impact on the administration and on payment card network operators, which are quite widespread in our society. And how was this all made concrete? Are there new inspectors that will have to be trained and put in position? I'd like to have your evaluation of the operability of this legislation.
The Financial Consumer Agency Act would administer the legislation, any regulations that come under the legislation if in force. At this time, we have released a code of conduct for the debit and credit card industry. Stakeholders have until May 17th to let the government know whether or not they will adopt that code. And the minister has been quite clear that if the stakeholders do not adopt the code, he will proceed to regulate. And it is that at that time, once the regulations are in force, that the FCAC would monitor regulations. In the meantime, though, the new legislative provisions also give the Commissioner of the Financial Consumer Agency the authority to monitor compliance with the Code of Conduct. And the Commissioner currently does this for a number of other Code of Conduct in the marketplace. My colleague Pascal is familiar with many others that the Commissioner monitors. In developing the Code of Conduct, we've worked quite closely with the Commissioner to speak with them, or the agency officials, to discuss compliance issues and how they go about monitoring the code. And they are quite comfortable that, consistent with other codes of practice, they have the resources in place to carry out that work. They, as part of the code, they will have the ability to levy assessments on the industry if required to monitor compliance with the code to cover any additional costs. So I think in setting up the code and in preparing the regulations, we feel that the Financial Consumer Agency feels equipped to properly do its functions.
Est-ce à dire, si on parle de la création de cette nouvelle loi-là?
Does that mean that with the creation of this new legislation, or in the past, the government or the minister could not intervene with regard to payment card networks, so you needed this legislation to be able to act properly?
In the first instance, as I mentioned, we've put in place a code of conduct. So we just released that April 16th. So the government is taking action in that regard. It's not legislation, it's a code of conduct. But what this legislation does is give the ability for the minister, should stakeholders not adopt the code, to proceed with regulations to make it enforceable.
Est-ce que, à votre connaissance,
to your knowledge, does the code of conduct does not talk about abusive rates from credit card issuers charged to business people who have not a word to say about that. In your discussions, will a consensus be needed in order to take position and to take into account both the operators as well as card issuers?
That is the very purpose of the code, is to bring fairness to merchants, to be able to control their costs and increase competition in the marketplace. Gives them, it requires networks and all those involved in providing services to merchants to clearly disclose the costs of those services. It allows merchants to cancel a contract if they sign up and then suddenly 3 months later the rates go way up. It allows them to discount to encourage consumers to use lower cost payment methods. So there's a whole range of elements in that code that really seek to empower merchants in their relationship vis-a-vis some of these networks. So it's a great first step in dealing with some of these issues that we've heard a lot about from merchants.
Okay. Merci, M. Carrier. Si vous voulez aller après, je vais en donner la chance.
Thank you, Mr. Carrier. Mr. Mulcair, good afternoon. Thank you for appearing. I want to make sure I understood correctly when you said that there would be a code of conduct implemented, but there could also be enforceable legislation. So you speak of a voluntary code of conduct. Is that correct? That wouldn't appear in the transcript.
You're saying very quick. No, yes, it is a voluntary code of conduct in the first instance, but the minister has made it clear that should members not adopt the code, he will make it involuntary.
Even though the legislation is sparse, it provides for interpretation and application. Where are the provisions for interpretation and application, enforcement and inspection of a voluntary code?
I guess the framework that surrounds the monitoring of voluntary codes is embedded within, or it's established by the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada Act. And that empowers the commissioner to get information from certain institutions to monitor and so on. So,
Quel article de la loi?
Section of the bill are you referring to?
Anybody could answer. Everybody that's in the front, anybody could answer. You've got all your name tags. You're all identified. So.
Allez-y, mademoiselle, si vous l'avez déjà, dites-le.
If you have the number. Well, that information is contained in the section that amends the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. Yes, yeah, I'm in that part. But more specifically, there are elements throughout that part, namely Clause 18, which amends Section 1842 in particular, as well as what page is that on? 548 and 549 of the bill. Go ahead. Could you help me to find a reference to the voluntary code of conduct within the bill?
subsection 2, part 3, subsection C, allows the FCAC to monitor any public commitments, but it also allows them to monitor the implementation of voluntary codes of conduct that have been adopted by the payment card network operators.
Maintenant, on va regarder le projet de loi proposé.
Look at the proposed bill, section 5, paragraph 2. Are we together on this now? It requires that they operators, the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada shall examine at least once a year and report to the minister, and there is a series of investigatory powers. Do those same powers exist under the voluntary code of conduct? Do the same powers of investigation exist under the voluntary code of conduct? Section 5, paragraph 6. At the end of the article, the section, it said that are confidential and must be treated, confidential must be treated accordingly. Is there a provision that for fines because the security of information obtained by card operators is very important? Are there provisions for fines in such cases?
We can't assess fines. If regulations are in place, then yes, we can.
Okay. Ça, c'est une réponse générale à une question spécifique. Je vous remercie.
A general answer to a specific question, but my question was more specific. Now, let's forget the voluntary code for now, but if the bill comes into effect, now in section 5(6), information has to be confidential, must be treated accordingly. What is the penalty? Is there a penalty in the event of non-compliance? And I don't see that in the bill.
Held by the commissioner itself, or the information?
Toute loi s'interprète dans son contexte. On va regarder le contexte de la.
Let's consider the context of section 5(6). So we're establishing a framework for the eventual implementation, because it won't necessarily come into effect. But in the event it is, there's a host of information that's detained by the merchants or the operators, the network operators. It could easily be obtained by third parties. And it says that any information must be is confidential, must be treated accordingly. So my specific question is, what is the penalty, the sanction, if someone does not observe that section? If the confidential information isn't maintained, that information is very important. It can give an economic advantage, and that is worth a gold. That type of information is priceless. So I'm wondering, are there penalties provided?
The commissioner. So it's to protect its confidentiality of information, because clearly they receive a lot of sensitive business information. So to the extent that, and you see this in other legislation with the superintendent of financial institutions, to the extent that they receive confidential information from an institution, it is the obligation of the commissioner and anybody acting in respect of the commissioner to treat that information confidentially.
Ça, je l'ai bien compris. Je vais tenter de vous donner un exemple.
Understood that, but let me give you an example. Someone with a USB key can gather information and decides to sell information. And this section says that the information has to be treated confidentially. Well, that's a good intention. But if it cannot be applied and there are no sanctions, well, that's a...
Because this is targeted at information received by the regulator.
Présumons dans mon exemple que la personne qui se promène avec une clé.
Presume that someone walking around with information works for the commissioner, obtains information which is of great value, and decides to sell it. Now, to record that information and to sell it, that goes against subsection 5.6. And I would like to know what the sanction, the penalty is. Is there a penalty provided? Are there sanctions? Are there incarceration terms? Because there's no. You can't create a violation if you don't have a penalty. So I simply want to know, and because I don't see any guarantee that that information, aside from the intention to keep it confidential, I don't see how you can make that intention a reality.
From the Commissioner, to the extent that any person where their responsibilities are outlined in law, that they contravene them. I'm not an expert on the judicial system that would proceed, but it's a clear contravention of the law.
Mais elle est où, la contravention? C'est ça ma question.
Where's the sanction? And that's my question that I'm repeating. Where is the penalty here? It doesn't create an offense. If I might try to answer that question, what you seem to be talking about in your example would be a grave mishandling of an officer of that agency. But what you're referring to would be sanctioned under the Public Service Act. As public servants, we have obligations and duty, and we have to follow those duties. And if we show if we contravene that act, that contravention is covered by another legislation. Now you're talking about disciplinary measures. The same reprehensible action by a public servant could lead to a number of sanctions. So let's exit the public service. Let's take the case of a nurse who would steal morphine destined for a patient. That could contravene the criminal code, contravene a number of other pieces of legislation. And the order of nurses could take disciplinary measures, and that's what you evoke when you talk about the Public Service Act. But it's as if the only penalty would be meted out by the order of nurses. But here, there doesn't seem to be any sanctions, neither in both of your answers. The objective of this provision here, let me give you a concrete example. There's the Information Protection Act, and someone could say that I know that this person gave you this information and try to obtain it from the agency. And so this clarifies the protection given to that information. But that protection is purely fictitious if there are no penalties. You refer to the Information Protection Act. There are a series of offenses and penalties, a number of criminal provisions in that act. Nevertheless, for us, this is a serious shortcoming in this bill. I'm here to legislate, that is, to draw up legislation that will come into effect and that will be able to be enforced. This isn't enforceable. This is an intention. It's nothing personal. That's simply what I see here before me, and as a member, I see there are shortcomings here. That's all for now. Mr. Mena? We'll try to keep turns limited to 5 minutes. I'd like to reassure my colleague, my specialty is public safety, and this is the first time I sit in on this consideration. But for Mr. Mulcair's problem, I believe that when we've placed in the criminal code theft of information, I think then we will be able to impose deterrence in such cases as this one here, such as for the nurse who steals not cocaine but opium or morphine or what have you, or a drug whatsoever. That would be a criminal offense. And what he's describing is clearly information theft. In any case, I'm quite intrigued by this. We hear a lot of complaints with regard to the usual, the high interest rates by credit card companies. Is there something in this bill which brings a solution to that problem of high interest rates for credit cards? So then why do you have this Payment Card Networks Act? Am I to understand that payment card networks, those are the credit card companies?
Really targets the business practices of between networks and merchants and acquirers. We have other consumer protection legislation that deals with a broader set of issues, but this is quite targeted on that relationship.
En tout cas, je n'ai pas parlé beaucoup, mais je l'ai rencontré déjà. C'est une mésaventure.
In any case, I always lose my credit cards, or I've tried, and I've always paid my accounts on a monthly basis. But I have two credit cards. I have one that I always use and one that I keep on reserve. So I come back from travel for the government, and when I went to Australia and London, I put everything on the credit card for $20,000. I made a mistake when I paid through the internet. I paid $150 bill, and I deposited $20,000 there. And 3 weeks later, I received from the first credit card a statement that I have $19,500 in credit on my credit card. Of course, so very politely, they said, but the other credit card, the payment was late. So I immediately paid that amount, and I was 21 days late for the first time in my life, and about $2,500 I had to pay for 21 days late, for having paid late, 21 days. It seems to me that the criminal interest rates are something to be addressed. So after a discussion of an hour and a half, I said, we'll put an end to 21 years of good mutual cooperation, and I cut up my credit card, and I decided to go with another company. But I was astounded that they can charge such interest rates for so little time delay. On another side, merchants in my riding have come to me, food distributors came to see me and told me that more and more they have to offer a credit card services before people paid in cash. You gave me 5 minutes. Yeah, we're almost, those 5 minutes are almost up. So they say that in addition to the fact that they have to take credit cards, negotiate amounts, and that regularly the credit card companies are increasing their fees, and they don't have a word to say about that. And they also tell me that the rates aren't the same whether it's a good customer, people like me who pay their balances regularly, and they don't make money with me because they don't get to charge any late dues. And then the merchants are asked to pay more if it's on my credit card than if it's on the credit card of someone who's regularly late in paying his balance, and it pays late dues to the company. These are commercial activities that should be regulated. Are they covered by this bill?
To allow merchants to choose which debit services and credit services they accept to be able to opt out of contracts, to be able to clearly opt into contracts. So it's very much targeted at dealing with those very real concerns that merchants face.
Okay, merci. Merci. Ms. Bloch?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to keep this sort of direct and somewhat simple, I hope. We have established here today that the Minister of Finance has introduced a voluntary code of conduct for the credit and debit card industry, correct? We've also established that there is a deadline of May 17th for that industry to adopt the code.
That's right.
That if they don't, he will then regulate the industry. That's what this piece of legislation would do, correct?
That's right. It would give the regulation-making authority.
So would the Jobs and Economic Growth Act have to pass before that occurred?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McKay?
Not so long ago, CIBC had a huge amount of credit card information turn up in some place in Arkansas or some ridiculous place. And, well, I better correct myself. Arkansas is not a ridiculous place. Just somebody will write to me from Arkansas.
Reading the letter.
Yeah. You think not?
No. Come on, guys. Let's go. Let's go.
And the question, therefore, is: does this kind of legislation would that kind of situation be captured by this this kind of legislation?
That's not within the scope of this.
No. So, where is the code?
Where is it?
Yeah.
It can be found on the finance website.
I see. I just wonder why it's not included in our briefing materials here. It's not here. Yeah. Well, it's not in this part.
The other part.
It's not statute.
It's not
right?
part of the bill, per se.
No, I understand that. Will the code, because that's where the real guts of this matter is, will it deal with this negative option billing problem that the merchants identified, which was that we enhance the credit card and we pass the costs along to the merchant, and the merchant essentially has no choice about accepting that?
Element that deals with that, and it requires explicit consumer consent for them to get a new card that could potentially have higher fees for the merchant. Yeah.
Related to Mr. Menard's issue, one of the issues that was raised had to do with the fact that you could pay your bill electronically on time, but by the time the clearances went through between this, that, and the other thing, you were late. Does the code address that issue?
No, this is much more, it's focused on the business practices of networks and merchants, per se, largely, but so it doesn't touch on that issue.
Exactly. That's what effectively.
Okay, Mr. McKay.
You end up paying 3 days
Focus.
or 4 days
Focus.
ahead.
Focus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you.
Very helpful that way. I actually prefer the previous chair.
I am sure you did. I'm sure you did. Okay, members, it won't be the first time. It's all right. Part 13, 14, 15, all the way to 17. We okay? Or 13?
What?
Okay. Oui, Monsieur Carrière. 13.
Eh?
13.
Yeah, I know what 13. One at a time.
Allez, Monsieur Carrière.
Go ahead, Mr. Carrier. Let's concentrate ourselves. In Part 13, new powers and new responsibilities are conferred in financial matters to the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada in order to provide consumers with greater protection. And in Quebec, within the government of Quebec, there's the Office of Consumer Protection, which has existed since 1971. Its mandate is to inform, to educate the public with everything regarding consumer protection issues. It receives complaints and it can take action. I'm wondering whether Part 13 contains or contains an analysis of the various jurisdictions and whether there is an encroachment upon provincial jurisdiction with regard to consumer protection and the aspect within the Financial Consumer Agency. Has an analysis been done with regard to the sharing of jurisdictions? And would it not lead to conflicts with the various levels of government? The Financial Consumer Agency of Canada has existed since 2001. Its mandate has always been to ensure compliance of the various provisions for consumers contained in federal legislation on financial institutions and to promote financial literacy and education. The amendments that you have before you do not change anything to that mandate. They do not change the scope of what the agency can do. I'd say that the changes that were brought were to the effect that the agency sees information and can transmit that information to the government so that it can draw policy and laws and regulations to continue to protect consumers with regard to financial services. These proposed amendments are intended to improve the ability of the agency to, in a more proactive way, to gather information, to better inform the whole process of crafting public legislation, and if need be, to draw up legislation and regulations. It doesn't change anything to what has been done since 2001 at the agency and Consumer Protection Office in Quebec. You say that the distinction is that the Financial Consumer Agency is federally regulated and deals with federal legislation, and that's how the distinction is made between the two orders of government. Yes, more specifically, the Financial Consumer Agency will address the consumer provisions within the Bank Act, within the Canada Businesses Corporations Act, the Insurance Company Act, and the Cooperative Act. Thank you. Part 14, 15.
What section? What section?
I'm assuming that you've rushed in your haste onto section 14. Is that where we're at now?
Yeah, we've only been here for 2 hours and an hour and 3/4.
You may have to
So
stay
it's
a
not
little
a haste.
longer.
It's not a haste.
You may have to stay
It's
a
called
little
moving it
longer.
along.
So we are on proceeds of crime? We are. Thank you, Chair,
14.
for that helpful
14.
comment.
14.
With respect to the change in Quebec Legal Counsel, what's the issue there?
It's actually just a housekeeping measure. The Department of Justice had done a review and noticed that there were some inconsistencies with the existing measures in the legislation, and so this was an opportunity to make those housekeeping changes. So it doesn't change anything in the legislation or the intent.
So what, for the purposes of the reporting and the purposes of disclosure, is there, what's the difference between a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada and a member of the Quebec Bar?
Sorry. There is no difference in terms of what the legislation says. It's, as I said, there was a definitional difference between the English and the French, but currently, although the legal profession is included in the Act, those provisions are not enforced because of an injunction dating back a number of years. So there is no effect. It's as I said, it's very much a definitional issue.
So legal counsel in Ontario and legal counsel in Quebec are treated exactly the same for the purposes of this legislation?
Yes, that's correct.
The changes to the legislation, in the notes it says that Canada has a comprehensive regime to combat money laundering. Currently, we're not able to take legally enforceable measures to protect the financial system from threats emanating outside of Canada. Could you give me a description of what does that actually mean? Give me an example of that.
Right now, for example, when the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international standard-setting body, draws the attention or issues a concern regarding a particular jurisdiction, it will call on its members to take graduated proportionate measures against that jurisdiction. There's nothing in the Act right now that allows Canada to take legally enforceable measures, so that is a gap in our system that this legislation or these amendments would rectify.
Example?
For example, the FATF might say call on members to conduct enhanced customer identification on transactions between its members and a particular jurisdiction. Right now, the legislation includes all those sorts of customer verification issues as a matter of course, but there's no way for the minister or for the government to say we want you to enhance them vis-a-vis that particular jurisdiction. So it might be, for example, somebody wants to conduct a transaction, send however much money to that jurisdiction. We might want to say, okay, produce your ID again just to verify, or maybe there might be a provision for getting a bank manager to verify the transaction just to make sure that it's clear that it's a legitimate
So would this apply, to pull a random example, would this apply to something, money either coming or being sent to Pakistan or Afghanistan? Would that attract an enhanced attention from the financial institution?
Right now, the legislation enables, there's a risk-based approach so that if a bank, for example, thinks that there's an enhanced risk in dealing with a particular customer, the legislation calls for enhanced measures, but it's left up to the discretion of the bank. What these amendments would do would allow the Minister of Finance to say, okay, now I'm telling you that there's an enhanced risk with this jurisdiction.
So you're taking away the discretion of the bank manager or the institution?
Yes, in terms of enabling the Minister to safeguard the Canadian financial system by identifying where there's a particular enhanced risk.
And can the Minister do this based upon any code? Is it entirely the discretion of the Minister, in other words?
The legislation has two triggers in it. One is if there's a call by an international body, such as the Financial Action Task Force or perhaps the United Nations, and that would be where a particular jurisdiction has been deemed to be high risk because it lacks effective or sufficient anti-money laundering or anti-terrorist financing measures. So it hasn't criminalized money laundering, it hasn't criminalized terrorist financing, it doesn't have a financial intelligence unit, it doesn't require mandatory suspicious transaction reporting, which all of those things which make up the comprehensive set of standards that most jurisdictions have agreed to implement. So that's the first trigger, and in order, I mean, we would take sort of from the Financial Action Task Force, for example, sort of a sense of the gaps in that regime. So, for example, the FATF does comprehensive evaluations of jurisdictions, and so we would see that. The other trigger is if there was a domestic trigger where maybe the FATF hadn't come out with a call, but there's a jurisdiction of concern, and Canada, maybe with a number of other like-minded jurisdictions, decided that in terms of the need to safeguard our financial sector, we should take
So absent
action
this
independently.
legislation, the individual institution or the manager can simply ignore the Minister?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. Mr. Mulcair?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to follow up with what Mr. McKay had to ask. There's a number of pieces of legislation. we're wondering whether it's appropriate to draw up lists. There's a legislation currently with regard to refugees, and what was been proposed was to draw up a list. There's another piece of legislation on terrorism, which was introduced for the third time last week. But there's also there the idea of drawing up lists. Here you're saying that it's a bit more volatile. Where can such a list be consulted, or does it remain secret? Can the minister say that this can impose this to banks, but does the public have access to these lists and information?
It would be public. It would be appear in the Canada Gazette.
D'accord. Donc, on parle d'un instrument statutaire.
This is a statutory instrument.
In here, there's two authorities. There's a directive-making authority, which is not a statutory instrument for the purpose of the Statutory Instruments Act, but the legislative amendments here are saying that it will nonetheless be gazetted exactly for that purpose. And the second instrument is regulation, which would go through the full regulatory process, including pre- and final publication.
Je ne veux pas vous traîner en dehors de votre domaine respectif.
I want to go outside of your area of expertise, and there will be other opportunities over the next few days, but I would like to ask you this question. In my writing and in others, more and more we have businesses that open shops that in return for compensation can send money to another country. So people who are here, who are working, can use their services and they can access those businesses. And generally speaking, that seems to function, except when things go wrong, they go wrong seriously. And there have been cases of major fraud where money has never been transmitted, and the RCMP was involved and tried to close some of those businesses. Here, when talking about the banks, they are extremely structured. Now, but those businesses that have opened their shops, how can you capture them with the structure that you are proposing here?
Are already covered under the legislation, and they're required to register with FINTRAC, the Financial Transactions Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, which means, and they are subject to the full legislation. So all the customer identification requirements, they're required to report certain transactions to FINTRAC, keep records, to have an internal compliance function, and they are subject to compliance and audit examinations by FINTRAC. And so that is the way the legislation treats them.
Ça, c'est pour l'aspect blanchiment de l'argent.
It's for money laundering.
Pour le blanchiment de l'argent, le financement du terrorisme.
Money laundering and terrorism financing. With regard to fraud, who deals with that aspect?
Be a law enforcement issue. If there isn't a question of money laundering or terrorist financing per se, this act doesn't apply. So
Non, pas cette loi-là, ni aucune autre.
This bill wouldn't apply, and we've seen a number of them. Neither other federal agencies that can ensure the probity of certain financial institutions. But they can also accumulate in important sums of money. People who tried to send money into another country found out that all that money had been kept and it disappeared. Contrary to a bank, we know that that can happen, but here there seems to be some gaps in the legislation.
On the scope of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Act to...
Je vais voir s'il y a d'autres groupes qui vont venir ici qui peuvent répondre.
Check whether other groups could answer my question, but thank you for your answers. Thank you, Mr. Mulcair. So we finished part 14. No more questions on that part. I suggest, rather than begin with part 15, I think there will be a number of questions on part 15 and 16, so I would suggest, if everyone agrees, we'd thank our witnesses for having come
regular scheduled time. Merci, thank you. Meeting adjourned.